From the outside, Shady Glen looked like any other nursing home. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the flower beds were bursting with color, and the windows gleamed under the sunlight. If you happened to drive past on a warm afternoon, you'd see exactly what you'd expect. Elderly residents taking slow, careful walks with their nurses, some sitting on benches soaking up the sun. It looked peaceful, normal. No one would ever suspect what was really inside. When I first got the job at Shady Glen, I was thrilled. Being a nurse was more than just a career to me. It was something I genuinely loved. It meant helping people, making their lives better, even in small ways. A new job at a new facility meant new friendships, new faces, and new opportunities to brighten someone's day. At least that's what I thought. Those hopes? Completely shattered. In my experience, most elderly folks are friendly. Sure, you get the occasional grouchy one, but for the most part, they love to talk. I've lost count of the number of times I stayed past my shift just to listen to a story someone needed to tell, some memory they wanted to share before it faded. I've played more games of checkers than I can remember, often at the request of a resident who just wasn't ready to be alone yet. And honestly, I didn't mind. I got pretty damn good at checkers, if I do say so myself. That's why I took this job, to make a difference. But there was one problem. No one at Shady Glen wanted to talk to me. During my break, I sat in the game room hoping to strike up a conversation. Nothing. No sweet old lady showing me pictures of her grandkids. No old man ready to tell me about the war. No one even said hello. Yet, they weren't completely ignoring me. I could feel them watching. In the corner, an elderly woman with soft, white hair sat with a book, but she wasn't reading it. She was staring. Right at me. And the second I turned my head, she snapped the book up to her face, pretending she'd been reading the whole time. She wasn't the only one acting strange. Across the room, two men were playing chess, or at least they were pretending to. Not a single move had been made in 20 minutes. They weren't focused on the game at all. They were watching me. And when I stood up and walked toward the trash can, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. Several heads turned. At the same time, they were tracking my movement. All of them, except for one. At the very back of the room, a woman sat in a rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth. Unlike the others, she wasn't watching me at all. She just stared out the window as if nothing in the room mattered to her. But something about her was off. She didn't look old. While every other resident had gray or thinning hair, hers was long, silky, and jet black, cascading down her back without a single silver strand. Her skin was pale, so pale it was like she'd never seen the sun in her life. My first thought was that she was a visitor, but that didn't make sense. It was barely 10 a.m. Visiting hours didn't start until noon. She wasn't a nurse either. No scrubs, no ID badge, no sign that she worked here at all. I suddenly felt a tight knot forming in my stomach. Grabbing my things, I decided to finish my break somewhere else. As I stepped toward the door, I could feel their eyes following me again, heads subtly shifting in my direction. I forced myself not to look, to just keep walking. Maybe they were just wary of new people. Maybe they were bored and curious about the new guy. That made sense, right? But it didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like something else. It wasn't just a few nosy residents peeking at me from behind a book or glancing my way over a chessboard. It was all of them, watching. Like they were silently passing a message between each other, like they all knew something I didn't. All of them, except her. She never looked at me once. I wasn't sure if that should make me feel better or worse. By the time I got back to the staff break room, a few other employees were already there, sipping coffee and making quiet conversation. Figuring this was as good a time as any to get a read on the place, I decided to bring it up casually. "The residents here aren't exactly social butterflies, huh?" I joked, pouring myself a cup. A guy sitting at the table, a physical therapist, if I remembered correctly, glanced up at me. "What do you mean?" "Well, at every other facility I've worked at, the elderly love to chat. They'll practically chase you down to tell you their life story. Here, it's like they've all taken a vow of silence." The guy gave a non-committal shrug. "Yeah, most of them keep to themselves." I leaned against the counter, debating whether or not to push further. "And what about that one woman? The one with the super pale skin and black hair? She doesn't look old enough to be a resident." The moment I said that, his posture stiffened. "Oh, you mean Elena? he said, his voice carefully neutral. Yeah, she's a patient here. I frowned. Seriously, how old is she? For a second, he didn't answer. Then, with an uncomfortable smile, he muttered, older than she looks. I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. Damn, must be a hardcore sunscreen user. She doesn't look a day over 40. That joke didn't land the way I expected. He just stared at me, then glanced at the two nurses sitting across from him. They exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations where you just know something's up. Then, without another word, the guy stood up. Anyway, I should get going, he mumbled. The nurses immediately followed his lead, dumping their half-full cups of coffee before trailing after him. The room, which had been filled with soft chatter just moments ago, now felt eerily quiet. I glanced at the clock. We still had 10 minutes left of break. So why did they all leave so suddenly? I chewed the inside of my cheek. So far, I wasn't making friends. Not with the residents, not with the staff, and that was unusual for me. I wasn't the most popular person in the world, but I was friendly, and making connections had never been this difficult before. Something was off about this place. Shaking it off, I cleared my trash and checked my schedule. My next patient was in room 40C. I headed down the long beige hallway, glancing at the seemingly endless rows of identical doors. The lighting overhead was harsh, buzzing faintly, casting dull yellow streaks against the walls. When I reached the door to 40C, I pulled up the patient's chart, then did a double take. There was a note scrawled across the top in sharp, almost frantic handwriting. Do not make eye contact with the patient. I blinked. What the hell? Maybe they were just extremely antisocial? Some residents didn't like being looked at directly. I'd dealt with that before. But usually, their charts had detailed notes explaining why. Flipping through the paperwork, I found no psychological evaluations, no mention of paranoia or social anxiety. The only thing noted was mild memory loss. I hesitated for a moment. Then I sighed. Whatever the reason, I'd respect their wishes, even if it made my naturally outgoing self itch with discomfort. Taking a breath, I pushed the door open. Inside, a woman sat motionless on the bed. Long, tangled gray hair spilled over half her face, obscuring most of her features. She wore a plain white dressing gown, though it looked old and slightly stained, like it hadn't been changed in a while. My instincts told me to look at her, to make eye contact the way I normally would when greeting a patient. But I caught myself at the last second, forcing my gaze downward, fixing it on the floor instead. Hi, I'm Jeff, I said, keeping my voice even. I'll be your nurse today. Silence. Is there anything I can get for you? I asked after a moment. Or should I go ahead and start your vitals? A pause. Then slowly she gave the faintest nod. I took that as my cue. Pulling the metal chair closer, I sat down beside her. This might pinch a little, okay? I murmured, carefully wrapping the blood pressure cuff around her arm. The air in the room felt oddly heavy. I kept my eyes locked on the gauge, hyper-aware of my own movements, making sure not to glance up at her face. But even without looking, I could feel her watching me. The sensation prickled along the back of my neck, an unblinking stare boring into me through the curtain of her hair. I swallowed. Just gonna check your ears now, I said, reaching for the otoscope. My hands moved with practiced ease, but my body felt stiff, unnatural. I kept my focus locked on her ear, resisting the instinct to meet her gaze. But as I adjusted my angle, something shifted in my peripheral vision. Her eyes. I wasn't looking directly at them, but I could still see just enough to notice that something was wrong. They were too big. Not just slightly large, not just a trick of the light. Too big for her face. A sinking feeling curled in my stomach. I could only glimpse them from the edges of my vision, but there was something unnatural about their shape. Like they weren't just bigger than normal, but wrong in a way I couldn't quite put into words. Maybe it was her pupils? Were they dilated? Had she had an eye exam earlier today? That would explain the darkness, right? But it wasn't just her pupils. It was everything. Her irises, the whites of her eyes, the sheer size of them. Like she was wearing some kind of eerie Instagram filter that distorted them, making them stretch too far across her face. I gripped the tongue depressor a little tighter. Now I'm just gonna take a look at your throat. As I leaned in, her lips parted slightly. I forced my gaze downward, keeping my attention on her mouth, on the wooden stick pressing against her tongue. But I could still feel her watching me. and every fiber of my being was screaming not to look back. It was weird. I avoided making eye contact despite really wanting to. After finishing up, I packed my things, gave a polite farewell, and stepped out of the room. "You did good," I reassured myself while heading toward my next patient. "You respected her boundaries. That probably meant a lot to her. Maybe this first day wouldn't be so bad after all." That optimism didn't last long. My next patient was in room 37A, a man named Gerald. The chart said he was 86, but judging by his frail, shrunken frame, he could have easily been pushing a century. His body seemed to have collapsed inward, folds of thin skin draping over his bones. Sparse tufts of white hair jutted straight up, almost as if they were trying to compensate for the height he had lost over the years. Unlike the others, Gerald was immediately friendly. As soon as I stepped inside, he smiled at me. "Hello? Are you my new nurse?" I nodded and introduced myself. And just like that, I was back in my element. Gerald was easy to talk to. He asked how long I'd been a nurse, whether I liked working here, all while grinning and nodding like he was genuinely excited to have someone new around. "My last nurse was always so grumpy," he said, rolling his eyes dramatically. "But you seem like a fun one." "I try," I said, laughing as I wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his thin arm and started inflating it. "So, Gerald, where did you grow up?" That's when things changed. His smile vanished. His gaze flickered toward the wall, suddenly distant. A long, heavy silence stretched between us before he finally muttered, "A great distance away from here." I took the hint and didn't push. For a moment, it seemed like that was the end of the conversation, but then slowly, Gerald lifted his head. His milky, clouded eyes locked onto mine, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something rough. Something almost hollow. "I come from a place where demons roam." A chill prickled at the back of my neck. "A place where shadows don't need light." The words felt wrong. A place of eternal darkness. I froze mid-movement, my grip tightening around the cuff pump. I dealt with plenty of patients suffering from dementia, paranoia, or other mental conditions. This wasn't the most unsettling thing I'd ever heard. There was the man who swore he worked for a top-secret government agency. Every single day, he'd describe, down to the most graphic detail, the death threats he believed were sent to him. He was convinced there were people out there who wanted him dead in horrifyingly creative ways. Then, there was the woman who refused to sleep in her bed because she was convinced someone was hiding underneath it. After checking multiple times, we figured out she was mistaking a couple of old storage boxes for a person. It's hard, growing old. The mind starts slipping. Reality blurs, and the things lurking in the corners of your imagination feel real. And when you're dealing with people in this state, there's a balance. You don't want to feed into their delusions, but you also don't want to dismiss them outright. They need to feel heard. "You must be happier here," I offered gently. He hesitated. For a second, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a quiet, almost uncertain voice, he finally said, "I'm happier here." I smiled. "That's great." I finished checking his vitals, grabbed the iPad, and stepped out into the hallway. As I scrolled through his medical records, something caught my eye. There was no mention of dementia, no psychiatric concerns, nothing. In fact, under mental state, someone had marked it as good in clear, confident handwriting. That made me pause. Before I could process it, a voice called from behind. "Jeff." I turned. The old man had followed me out into the hallway. He stood perfectly still a few yards away, his frail body silhouetted under the fluorescent lights. His expression was eerily neutral, but his cloudy eyes were locked onto mine. "Do you need something?" I asked, forcing a polite smile. He shook his head. His lips barely moved as he muttered, "They roam here too, the demons. They're just not as loud." A chill ran down my spine. I gave him a small nod, forced a casual wave, and turned back to the iPad. Under mental conditions, I added a note, talks about demons. Shaking it off, I checked my list. Next patient, Mary Gonzalez, room 29B. I took the elevator to the second floor and walked down the hallway. She was at the far end, past a seemingly endless row of identical beige doors, each with a small square window. The distorted, looping music playing through the intercom only made the atmosphere feel more surreal. It was warped, like an old cassette tape struggling on low battery. My fingers twitched. Maybe I should start sending out more applications. I didn't like this place. Not the lingering stares, not the strange encounters, not my cold, distant coworkers who barely acknowledged my presence. There was something off about this facility, something I couldn't quite name. And then, as I walked past 26C, I saw something that made my stomach drop, a padlock. I stopped, stepping back to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The number 26C was barely legible. The digits faded with time. The small window was pitch black, completely dark, like there was no light in the room at all. Maybe it's empty. But if it was empty, why the lock? I frowned. That wasn't standard protocol. Patients couldn't just be locked away like this, unless they were a severe risk to others. But even then, they'd be transferred somewhere more appropriate. Not left here, locked behind a door in a long-term care facility. I stepped closer. The window was too dark to see anything inside. Even the hallway lights didn't help. I pressed my hands against the glass, trying to get a better look. And then, something blinked. I staggered back with a sharp inhale. My ankle twisted. My balance gave out. I hit the linoleum floor hard, pain shooting up my elbows and knees. Something moved behind the window. A shifting mass of black hair slid away from the glass, parting just enough to reveal a single, unblinking eye staring back at me. My heart slammed against my ribs. The room wasn't dark. The reason I couldn't see inside was because she had been pressed against the window the entire time, watching me. And worse, I recognized her. Pale skin, long, thick black hair, too young to be in a place like this. It was the same woman I had seen earlier. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't stop until I reached 29B. My breath was uneven. My legs felt shaky. I forced myself to inhale, then exhale, trying to steady my racing heart. It's just a woman, not a monster. Maybe she had a mental condition. Maybe that's why she was here. But then, why the padlock? I swallowed hard and took another deep breath. Then another. Get it together. I had a patient to see. I squared my shoulders, plastered on my best professional expression, and finally pushed the door open. Mary sat by the window, gazing down at the courtyard below. Her shoulders swayed slightly as she hummed a slow, eerie melody. I didn't recognize the tune, but my old high school music teacher's voice echoed in my head. Minor key. Something about it made my skin prickle. I cleared my throat. "How are you doing today, Mary?" She didn't acknowledge me, didn't turn to make eye contact, just kept humming those same 4 notes, looping them endlessly. Mary? No response. I sighed, pulled out the iPad and scrolled through her chart. That's when I spotted the note. Patient is nonverbal. Okay, no eerie mystery there, just a medical condition. I grabbed a chair and sat beside her, speaking softly as I prepared for the exam so she wouldn't be startled. "I'm gonna take your blood pressure now, all right?" My voice was steady, my hands careful. "Just a quick look in your ear." I gently tugged her earlobe, angling the otoscope inside. My breath caught. A shadow curled near her eardrum. My stomach turned as I adjusted the light, trying to get a better look. The moment the beam hit it, the shadow twitched, then vanished. I stiffened. What the hell was that? I adjusted the otoscope, repositioned it. Nothing. The darkness was gone. Her ear looked completely normal. I lowered the tool and rubbed my temples. "You're exhausted," I told myself. "Shadows shift when the light moves. That's all. Deep breath in, deep breath out." "Your ears look good, Mary," I said, though the usual confidence in my tone was missing. I wrapped the exam, packed my kit, and stood to leave. Mary's humming continued, the same 4 notes, but now she was repeating them faster. I walked into the hallway, trying to shake off the unease. My pace quickened as I passed room 26C, eyes fixed straight ahead. By the time I reached the elevator, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Down to the first floor. Lunch break. Alone. No conversation, no forced smiles. I just wanted to get through the shift, get home, and start looking for a new job. I couldn't stay here much longer. A month at most, probably less. I chewed through my turkey sandwich, the thought settling in my mind. This place was just too strange. The afternoon passed without incident. No unsettling comments about demons. No eerie humming. Just routine checkups, quiet patients, and an uneventful shift. By evening, most of the residents had retreated to their rooms, the halls emptying. As the clock neared 7:45, I packed up my things, ready to clock out and hand off responsibilities to the night crew. But of course, it wasn't that simple. My boss poked his head in and asked for a favor. The night nurse was running late. Could I check in on one last patient? Like an idiot, I agreed. I was already halfway down the second floor hallway when I checked the room number, 26C. I stopped cold. The woman with the dark hair, the one who didn't belong here. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to walk away. But I needed this job, at least for a little while longer. And besides, they wouldn't keep someone dangerous here. That would be illegal. The padlock was unsettling, but maybe it was for her safety, not anyone else's. Maybe she had a tendency to wander. 15 minutes, that's all. Then I could go home. I opened the patient chart on the iPad, skimming through the details, or rather, the lack of details. Her name was Elena. The last name was long, filled with consonants, maybe Polish or Czech. But her birth date? Nothing. Just a blank space. They didn't know how old she was. And under medications, nothing. No conditions, no prescriptions, no chronic illnesses, no diabetes, no arthritis, no hearing issues. Why was she even here? Or had someone handed me an incomplete chart? Maybe that was my way out. If the file wasn't filled out properly, I could claim I couldn't complete the exam and just go home. If there was some undisclosed medical condition I hadn't been informed about, it could pose a serious risk. I walked briskly down the dimly lit hallway, scanning for one of the doctors on staff. After a few moments, I spotted one leaning against the nurse's station, scribbling something onto a clipboard. "Hey, I think something's off with Elena's chart," I said, trying to keep my voice even. I held up the iPad, tapping at the blank sections of her file. The doctor barely glanced up. "That's her chart," he said, giving it a brief, dismissive look before returning to his notes. "But nothing's filled in, not even a birth date. We don't have a birth date." His words made me pause. "You don't know her birth date?" I repeated, like I had misheard him. He shook his head, still not looking at me. "Okay then, what about an estimate, an approximate age, medical conditions, literally anything? The entire thing's just empty." Now he finally met my eyes. "I assure you," he said, voice lower, slower than before, "the chart is accurate." Something about the way he said it sent a chill through me. I opened my mouth to ask more, but before I could, he turned on his heel and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. I stood there, gripping the iPad tighter, my pulse thudding in my ears. None of this made sense. A nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that I should leave, that I shouldn't go back to that room. But I needed this job, at least for now. So, against every instinct screaming at me to walk away, I headed back to Elena's door. The padlock was already undone. Someone had been here. Someone had unlocked it for me. I hesitated, taking a slow breath to steady myself. Then I pushed the door open. Elena was seated by the window, her back to me, bathed in the cold glow of the outside lights. Her long black hair cascaded over the back of the chair, her arms resting limply at her sides, as if she had been sitting in that exact position for hours. "Hi, I'm Jeff," I said from the doorway, my voice catching in my throat. "I'll be taking your vitals this evening." She didn't respond. She didn't move. That was fine. Honestly, I'd rather have silence than the alternative. I pulled a chair next to her and unfolded the blood pressure cuff, the sound of the Velcro cutting through the thick, oppressive quiet. "I'm gonna check your blood pressure now," I said, carefully wrapping the cuff around her upper arm. Still, no response. Not a flicker of acknowledgement. The cuff began to inflate, the rhythmic hissing noise filling the space between us. She continued staring out the window, utterly motionless, as if I wasn't even there. The dim light sharpened her features, casting deep shadows across her skin, making her already pale complexion look almost sickly. I glanced down at the dial, waiting for a reading. Seconds passed, then more. Nothing. I frowned. That's strange. I adjusted the cuff, making sure it was positioned correctly, then tried again. Still nothing. Swallowing hard, I pulled it off. "Sorry, I think I might have messed up." I secured it again, double-checking the fit, making sure everything was in place before attempting a third time. Still. No. Reading. My fingers tightened around the cuff. This wasn't normal. This wasn't possible. I licked my lips, suddenly aware of how dry my mouth felt. Screw it. "Elena, I'll check your blood pressure later," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "For now, I'm just gonna take a quick look at your ears, all right?" No answer. No movement. She wouldn't even turn toward me. Something about that, her complete, unwavering stillness, made my stomach knot. I needed to see her face. Just a glimpse. I shifted slightly in my chair, angling myself so I could catch her reflection in the window, And that's when I froze. My breath hitched. My chest locked up. Every muscle in my body went rigid. Because I didn't see her reflection, I only saw mine. Wide-eyed, terrified. No, that's not possible. The blood drained from my face. My mind scrambled for an explanation, some rational, logical reason why she wouldn't be there, why the glass reflected only the room, the chair, and me. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I stood so fast that the chair skidded backward, nearly tipping over. I needed to get out, now. Heart pounding, I stumbled toward the door, my hands clammy as I fumbled for the handle. I'm sorry, I stammered. I'll come back later. A shuffling sound came from behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. She was looking right at me now, but something was terribly wrong. Her body remained perfectly still facing the window, yet her head had twisted all the way around, an unnatural, impossible motion that no human should be capable of. My stomach dropped, and instinct took over. I bolted. My legs carried me down the dimly lit hallway, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I turned the corner at full speed. My shoes smacked against the linoleum, each step echoing through the empty corridor. As I passed the recreation room, I caught glimpses of heads turning, faces tracking me with eerie synchronicity. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I just kept running. Dread twisted inside me as I realized I wasn't running alone. She was following me, but not in the way a person should. No. She was crawling, her limbs contorted, her spine arched at an unnatural angle. Moving on all fours, her upside-down head hung loosely, thick strands of black hair dragging behind her like a funeral veil. And her face, her mouth, twisted into something that barely resembled a grin. Her teeth, all of them, sharp, needle-like points, gleamed in the dim light. Her hands smacked against the floor as she scuttled forward, faster than anything should be able to. Her eyes locked onto me, unblinking. Her jagged grin never wavered. I forced my legs to move faster, ignoring the burn in my muscles, my lungs screaming for air. The elevator was just ahead. Just a few more steps. Just a little more. I glanced over my shoulder, my vision blurring with terror. She was too fast, too close. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wasn't gonna make it. Something grabbed my arm. I yelped, my body jerking sideways as I was yanked. Not backward, but into a darkened room. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing me away from whatever horror lurked outside. My heart hammered in my chest as I spun to face my rescuer, a nurse, one of the same nurses I'd seen earlier in the break room. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't exactly calm either. What is she? I rasped, backing away from the door as it could burst open at any second. The nurse stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. You can't do that. Do what? My breath came out in short, uneven bursts. I'm trying to keep you safe, she said quickly, her voice strained. You can't run from them like that. They can smell fear. But, she cut me off. Once you're here, they know you. They know your scent. Running only makes it worse. They'll track you. No matter where you go in the world, they'll follow. But if you stay, if you do as you're told, if you don't make them interested, you'll be fine. The room felt smaller, suffocating. My pulse pounded against my skull. What are you talking about? Her expression darkened. They don't let their secrets leave this place. If you run, they will chase you. If you leave, they will find you. Stay. Follow the rules. Don't let them notice you. She reached behind her, unlocked the door, and pulled it open. I think you have an exam to finish. My feet remained planted. I should have listened to her. She'd saved me, after all. She was warning me for my own good. She was trying to help me. But the moment the door creaked open, instincts took control. I ran. I shoved past her, tearing down the hallway toward the elevator. Behind me, I heard her yell, maybe my name, maybe something else. But I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. My only focus was on those steel doors. Elena was moving again, faster, closer. Her crawling form shot down the corridor like a spider hunting prey. The sight made my stomach twist in terror. My hand slammed into the elevator button. Again. Come on. The doors slid open. I threw myself inside and pounded the close button, my fingers trembling. The last thing I saw before the doors sealed shut was her, Elena, her black eyes locked onto mine, her mouth stretched into that impossible grin. Then the elevator began to descend. Down. I nearly collapsed against the wall, my hands gripping my knees as I sucked in deep, shuddering breaths. When the doors opened, I didn't hesitate. I shot out into the parking lot, my legs barely carrying me as I scrambled into my car. My hands fumbled with the keys. The second the engine roared to life, I floored it, speeding out of there like my life depended on it. But as I turned onto the road, I made one last mistake. I looked back. My eyes landed on a second-story window. A figure stood there, watching me, pale skin, thick black hair. I swallowed, forcing my gaze forward. Then I pressed the pedal to the floor and didn't look back again. I spent the rest of the evening trying to push the entire experience out of my mind. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from my boss, asking where I had disappeared to, but I let it go unanswered. A few calls from unknown numbers followed, and I ignored those too. As far as I was concerned, Shady Glen was in my past. I was never going back. That place wasn't normal. The people inside weren't normal. The woman with those impossibly large eyes. The man who muttered about demons as if they were right beside him. The woman who harbored something grotesque inside her ear. And then, of course, Elena. That entire place. Its patience, its never-ending halls, it was all a nightmare, and I was free of it. Or so I wanted to believe. But when my eyes flew open at 3:06 a.m., I realized the nightmare had followed me. My pulse was already hammering in my chest before I fully woke up, as if my body sensed something before my mind could catch up. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. Grabbing my phone from the nightstand, I forced myself to move, scanning the darkness for the source of the sound. It wasn't coming from my room. It was downstairs. My legs felt like lead as I moved toward the staircase, each step slow and deliberate. I kept my phone clutched tightly in one hand, my thumb hovering over the call button, 911 already typed in. The tapping didn't stop, steady, persistent, growing louder as I descended. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my breath shallow, and then I turned my head toward the kitchen. A figure stood at the sliding glass door, pale, motionless. Her long black hair clung to her face like wet strands of ink, her lips curled back to reveal needle-thin teeth. Elena. I dropped to the floor instantly, pressing myself out of sight, my hands shaking. But the moment I did, the tapping changed. Faster, harsher, more frantic. She knew I was there. I bolted. Racing back up the stairs, the nurse's warning replayed in my head like a death sentence. They'll follow you. No matter where you go, they'll follow. But if you stay, if you obey, you'll be safe. I reached my bedroom and shoved the door shut, locking it with trembling fingers before yanking the dresser across it. I barely had time to think before pressing the call button on my phone. The dispatcher assured me officers were on the way. I just had to hold on. With my pulse hammering, I scrambled into the closet, shut the door, and curled into the smallest space I could manage. The silence stretched, long and suffocating. My own breathing was too loud in the stillness. I strained to hear, waiting for another sound, another sign that she was still there. But nothing came. Maybe she was gone. Maybe I was safe. I took slow, controlled breaths, trying to steady myself. The police would be here soon. I just had to hold on a little longer. And then I heard it. But this time, it wasn't coming from the glass door downstairs. It was coming from my bedroom window, the second-story window. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to look. But I could picture her. Her twisted body clinging to the side of my house, her limbs bent at unnatural angles. Her long, claw-like fingers tapping against the glass, her thick black hair hanging in tangled clumps. And that smile, that horrific, razor-toothed grin. Then, sirens. The tapping stopped. I heard her scuttling down the side of the house, the sound of her retreating into the night. And then, nothing. The flashing lights spilled through the cracks in my blinds. My chest heaved, my heart still racing, but the worst was over. Or at least it should have been. Except the nurse's warning still rang in my ears. You're never safe, not unless you come back. And that's why, after an entire night without sleep and 3 cups of coffee that did nothing to steady my nerves, I found myself driving back to Shady Glen. I passed the neatly trimmed lawns, the elderly patients soaking in the morning sun, the quiet, controlled environment that masked the horrors lurking inside. I walked through the front doors, down those endless, beige-colored halls, the soft hum of music drifting from the overhead speakers. My hands trembled as I picked up the iPad, scanning my first assignment. Then, as I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 4th floor, I repeated one thing in my head, over and over. don't show fear.